Something happened inside the royal house of Aldemore that nobody in the press saw coming, and the way it happened is almost more interesting than what was actually won. Because for years, King Alaric had operated under one quiet assumption, that as sovereign he could reorganize the family's assets however he wanted. He believed he held final say over royal property, royal titles, and everything tied to them. And on the 25th of March, he learned in writing that he did not. What makes this story so compelling isn't just that Prince Julian won a fight. It's that he exposed a misunderstanding sitting at the very top of the monarchy about what a king can and cannot undo. And he did it by being the one person in the family who had kept every single receipt. Here's where it begins. Queen Miriam, before she died, made a series of decisions that were extremely deliberate. She had watched her family change over the decades. She had watched pressure build around money, titles, and control, and she knew precisely what she wanted locked into place before she was gone. The dukedom of Faircross was going to Prince Julian. That was never open for debate. The title had defined her husband, Prince Consort Edmund, for more than 60 years. It had been his life's entire framework. Miriam made certain it would pass to the one son who had stayed steady, who had avoided scandal, who had never once brought the family embarrassment. That promise was fulfilled the spring after her death, when King Alaric formally handed his younger brother the dukedom. If the story ended there, everything would have been fine. But the title was only half of what Julian inherited. The other half was Faircross Hall. And that is where the situation turns complicated in a way that actually matters. Faircross Hall is not merely a house. It is a sprawling, ivy-choked manor of nearly 100 rooms, set on 50 acres inside the royal parklands, the ancestral seat of the dukedom itself. In her final years, Queen Miriam signed a letter of intent tying the estate directly to the Faircross title. That letter was witnessed by Prince Consort Edmund as he lay dying. He understood exactly why it mattered. He knew that without it, Julian could lose everything connected to the title he'd waited a lifetime to receive. So Miriam locked it in. The title and the estate were meant to remain bound together. Her decision, clearly documented, properly witnessed. But after she was gone, a very different mindset took hold inside the palace. Alaric had believed for years, and this belief is the root of everything that followed, that modernization gave him license to review the family's holdings, to cut costs, to restructure, and if necessary, to reclaim what he felt the crown could no longer justify keeping outside its control. By the following year, that belief had become action. There were quiet reviews of royal leases, financial audits, pressure applied behind closed doors to reshape how family members lived. Faircross Hall became a target. Here is where it turns genuinely difficult to watch. Julian had waited his entire life for that dukedom. He'd watched his father carry the title for decades before finally stepping into it himself. And within 3 years, the very institution that had granted it to him began quietly working to strip away the home that gave the title its meaning. He wasn't just being challenged, he was being hollowed out. Because without Faircross Hall, a dukedom becomes empty. A name with no foundation, a title with no weight behind it. And what makes this even harder to justify, once you look closely, is what Julian had actually taken on when he accepted that estate in the first place. Faircross Hall was in ruinous condition when it was offered to him. The building had sat empty for years, unused and deteriorating, and the Crown Estate hadn't even wanted to keep it as a residence. There had been serious internal discussion about converting it into a conference venue or a hotel annex. That's how little value anyone assigned it at the time. Instead, it was handed to Julian under a long lease with unusually generous terms on paper, a token annual rent locked in for decades. But that low rent came bundled with an enormous obligation. He had to restore the place, not eventually, immediately. And he did. He poured more than £1 million of his own money into it, money he had earned himself, long before he became a full-time working royal. The total restoration bill climbed close to $3 million. The crown covered a portion. Julian carried the rest. Once the work was finished, his rent was raised to reflect fair market value, and an independent audit confirmed the new figure was legitimate. And here's the detail that stands out most when you compare his conduct to everyone else's in the family. His own brother, Prince Desmond, had lived rent-free in a comparable royal property for years, a fact the same audit body had quietly documented without consequence. One brother followed every rule and paid his way in full. The other did not. And now the institution that had tolerated that double standard for years was turning its full attention onto the brother who had done everything correctly. Julian, characteristically, had gone even further to secure his position. Years earlier, through a private holding company, he'd paid a substantial lump sum to extend his lease to 150 years, with contractual rights to sell or sublet the remaining term and keep any profit himself. That is long-term thinking. That is a man building both security and leverage. So by the time all of this came to a head, that same property, thanks entirely to his investment, had appreciated to something in the neighborhood of £30 million. If the Crown Estate reclaimed it, it could be resold or released for enormous profit. So when the pressure began mounting on Julian to hand it back, it was never only about modernization. The financial motive was sitting in plain sight the entire time. This is where Prince Consort Edmund's foresight becomes impossible to ignore. He saw this exact scenario coming, which is precisely why he insisted that letter of intent be formally witnessed and recorded. Edmund had spent his own 6 decades inside the institution watching how it operated behind closed doors, watching it move quietly and efficiently against people it no longer found useful. He was not going to let that happen to his youngest son. So, as he lay dying, he put his name to a document specifically designed to make that outcome impossible. By the time the confrontation finally arrived, Julian was ready. His legal file rested on 3 pillars: the original lease demonstrating his own financial investment, the letter signed by Miriam and witnessed by Edmund binding Faircross Hall to the dukedom for his lifetime, and 2 decades of maintenance records proving he had kept the estate in a condition that had, if anything, saved the crown money rather than cost it any. But even with all of that assembled, one uncomfortable fact still made the whole situation dangerous. Alaric controlled the machinery. He controlled the structure that could make a person's life inside the institution extraordinarily difficult without ever technically breaking a rule. So even with the evidence laid out cleanly on the table, nothing was guaranteed. The fight had only just begun. And then it became far more personal, because this was never only about property. Earlier that year, before any lawyers arrived with a formal dossier, a palace official had shown up at Faircross Hall carrying a clipboard and a quietly worded instruction. The visit came from the office of Queen Consort Priscilla. It was described officially as a heritage jewelry audit, a routine review of items with historical significance. That was the framing. What it actually meant was simpler. Someone had arrived to count and question a piece of jewelry that Julian's wife, Duchess Helena, had worn as her own for 25 years. At the center of that audit sat one object, the Larkspur tiara. This was not some random item pulled from a vault at random. It had been made specifically for Helena's wedding, commissioned by Queen Miriam herself, built from antique elements drawn from an older royal collection and reworked into an original design. For nearly 2 decades, it was the only tiara Helena ever wore in public, and that detail matters more than people tend to realize. Helena had never been granted casual access to the grander state tiaras the way more senior royals were. That had simply been understood inside the family, never spoken aloud, but always clear. She had never been placed at the center. She'd stayed in a supporting position, and the Larkspur tiara had become her one signature piece. Take it away, and she was left holding nothing of her own. Priscilla's argument arrived dressed in legal language, but the underlying message was sharp. Because the tiara incorporated stones from an earlier royal era, it could technically be classified as crown property, meaning by that logic it belonged in the central vault and could only be issued out for official occasions. The implication was unmistakable. Helena would no longer own the tiara she had worn on her wedding day. She would have to request permission to wear it. And the logic underneath that argument was genuinely dangerous, because if it held up even once, it wouldn't stop at a single tiara. It would open the door to reclaiming dozens of personal gifts Miriam had given out across 70 years on the throne. It wouldn't stop with Helena. It would reach across the entire family. And in an irony nobody in the palace seemed to have fully thought through, it would eventually turn back on Priscilla herself, since much of her own jewelry collection had arrived through identical royal channels. Apply the same rule consistently, and her collection fell into the exact same trap. Julian's legal team noticed that immediately. But underneath the legal argument sat something darker still, because the public had watched this kind of maneuver before. Years earlier, a beloved necklace that had belonged to a tragically deceased royal in-law had been quietly returned to the vault after her death, then later redesigned into a brooch and worn publicly by another family member. The backlash at the time had been immediate and furious, and the memory of it had never fully faded. Now the same pattern seemed to be repeating, reaching into something deeply personal and using the institution itself to justify it. This time, Julian did not stay quiet. His lawyers answered with a single document that ended the argument at its foundation. A deed of gift signed by Miriam decades earlier, explicitly stating that the Larkspur tiara was a private wedding present, not a state loan, not a shared asset, not anything held in trust. It belonged to Helena, plainly and permanently. Miriam had also personally awarded Helena one of the crown's own honors, a distinction given directly by the sovereign for personal service, not a routine formality. Put together, the picture was unambiguous. Miriam had honored her, gifted her a wedding tiara, and then signed a legal document confirming ownership. That is a monarch making a deliberate, documented statement about who she trusted. Priscilla's audit wasn't really about jewelry at all. It was an attempt to push directly against that record. And Julian had built in one more layer of protection few people knew about. Years earlier, he had personally commissioned a matching set of jewelry designed specifically to accompany the tiara, a necklace and earrings meant to be worn together as a single artistic unit. The materials had been funded through the crown, but the design rights belonged to Julian outright. His lawyers argued, convincingly, that the tiara and the matching set formed one inseparable piece tied to his own creative work, meaning you could not remove one without unlawfully breaking apart the other. Behind all of the legal maneuvering sat something quietly personal. Helena had worn that tiara on her wedding day, and years later, at a public reception honoring a charitable trust Miriam had founded, she turned mid-speech and referred to the old queen, unscripted, as Mama. It slipped out in a room where every word was usually tightly controlled, and it revealed exactly how she saw her. The woman who had signed that deed was the same woman Helena had quietly come to think of as her own mother. And now someone else was trying to take that away. By the afternoon, everything came to a head. Julian's legal team delivered a direct warning. If the claim on the tiara wasn't dropped by the end of the day, they would release private letters written by Miriam. Letters that stated, in her own words, her wish that Helena retain full and permanent ownership of her personal jewelry. According to people close to the matter, those letters reportedly went further still, containing candid personal commentary about Priscilla herself. That threat was explosive because releasing them would do far more than defend one piece of jewelry. It would drag old, uncomfortable history back into public view. Miriam's famously cool, slow-thawing relationship with her son's second wife, the years it had taken before she'd fully accepted her into the family, tension that had never entirely disappeared. Alaric had spent years quietly rebuilding Priscilla's public image. Those letters could undo that work in a single afternoon. This had stopped being about a tiara. It was now about control, reputation, and legacy. By evening, the Larkspur tiara remained exactly where it had always been, in Helena's possession. But after the audit and the mounting legal pressure, Julian made his own move. He had the tiara placed into a private, high-security vault under the direct control of his own household security. No one was going to quietly review it, reclassify it, or relocate it without a fight. He had drawn his line. The written warnings had gone out. The palace had been backed into a corner. But pressure on paper alone was never going to settle this. What came next wasn't legal at all. It was personal, and it arrived in the form of Princess Marguerite. By that same afternoon, the confrontation moved out of formal offices and into a private sitting room inside the palace. When Marguerite walked in, the entire tenor of the situation shifted. There was no small talk, no soft opening, no attempt to cushion what she'd come to say. She went straight to the point. To understand why that moment carried so much weight, you have to understand what had changed in the years leading up to it. Marguerite and Helena had never been especially close. As recently as a few years earlier, Anyone watching the family could see the distance between them plainly. Marguerite has always been that way. She doesn't perform warmth, she doesn't feel. But then Prince Consort Edmund died, and that loss reshaped the family's internal structure entirely. Both Marguerite and Helena stepped forward to support the aging queen through her final year, and in doing so, began seeing each other almost daily. The old distance simply dissolved. By the time of Miriam's funeral, the change was visible to anyone paying attention. As the family stood waiting, Helena quietly placed a hand on Marguerite's back. A small gesture, but real. It signaled trust. And by the time this crisis reached its peak, that quiet closeness had become something protective, something ready to act. So when Marguerite walked into that room with King Alaric, she wasn't there as merely his sister. She was there to defend what their mother had already decided, and she made that unmistakably clear. She told him plainly that if he allowed this to continue, if he allowed private gifts from their mother to be reclassified or clawed back, then a monarch's word would come to mean nothing at all. Then she delivered the line that reportedly stopped the room cold, that if their mother's signature on a lease or a deed of gift wasn't worth the paper it was written on today, then his own signature would be worth even less tomorrow. She was attacking the very foundation beneath his authority. A sovereign's word only carries weight if people trust what he has put in writing, and that trust doesn't originate with him. It's inherited from every monarch who came before. Undermine that, and everything built on top of it weakens along with it. She had, it turned out, already reviewed the Faircross Hall paperwork herself and knew precisely what Julian had paid, what he had signed, and what the Crown Estate had formally accepted. Her position on it was simple and direct. Julian paid for that home. The Crown took his money under clearly stated terms. The agreement stands. There was nothing left to argue. Marguerite refused to treat the tiara and the estate as two separate disputes. She made it clear they were the same fight wearing two different faces. Both things Miriam had personally given, both backed by signed documentation, both now being challenged using an identical argument. And she made the stakes explicit. Succeed in taking one, and you open the door to taking the other. Once that door swings open, nothing their mother ever signed is safe again. There was a quieter, sadder thread running underneath all of this, one that had to do specifically with Helena. She had lost her own mother young, and over the years, Miriam had become the closest thing to a mother she had left. Marguerite understood exactly what that meant, having lost both her father and, not long after, her own mother in close succession. She knew what it felt like when those people are gone, and all that remains are the things they left behind. So when the tiara and the house came under threat, she didn't see paperwork sitting on a desk. She saw something being taken from someone who had already lost enough. There was one more layer beneath it. Marguerite had watched something like this happen once before, years earlier, to a woman she'd been close to, had watched that woman's position inside the family slowly dismantled, piece by piece, until almost nothing protective remained around her. She recognized the pattern instantly. Different people, same shape. And this time, she wasn't going to stand by quietly while it repeated. She went further still. She told Alaric that if Priscilla did not step back from this, she would act publicly rather than privately, that she would personally oversee a full audit of the Queen Consort's own household, down to every allocation and expense. That threat landed with real weight, because Marguerite is the one person in the family whose word on financial discipline people actually believe, without hesitation. If she said she would expose something, people understood she meant it. And she raised one final point. There had reportedly been quiet pressure to push Julian and Helena's children into full private status earlier than originally planned, stripping them of the protection and support that came with their positions. Marguerite shut that down immediately, making clear that decision belonged to the children's parents, not to the Queen Consort's office. By the time the meeting ended, everything had shifted. Alaric was left with two options, and neither was good. He could back Priscilla and risk badly damaging the credibility of his own authority, or he could step back and accept that certain lines simply cannot be crossed. There was no clean way out. And as Marguerite left that room, one thing had become obvious. This was no longer only Julian's fight. It had become a direct challenge to the king himself. After reviewing the complete file, Alaric's own legal counsel delivered their conclusion plainly. Julian's position was essentially unbreakable. Every element held. No royal directive could override it. For years, Alaric had operated on an assumption that had felt self-evident to him.